The chipped formica of the diner booth felt cold under my forearms. October in Hollow Creek, North Carolina wasn't exactly a warm embrace, more like a damp, gray shrug. Steam curled from the coffee, smelling faintly of burnt sugar and regret sudi a fitting aroma considering 3 years. 3 years since the Henderson Report, since my name became synonymous with carrier suicide in certain academic circles. 3 years since I traded lab coats for a park ranger uniform in a town nobody could find on a map without seriously trying. Old Man Tiber, the diner's owner, slid a plate of greasy biscuits and gravy my way. He hadn't said a word since I'd sat down, just grunted and filled my mug. Hollow Creek wasn't a place for small talk with newcomers, especially ones who looked like they hadn't slept properly in a week, which, admittedly, wasn't far from the truth. "You the new ranger?" Tiber finally rasped, not looking up from wiping down the counter. "That is me, Arlo Creed," he grunted again. "Heard you were from up north, city boy." "Yas to be," I said, picking at a biscuit. It tasted like yesterday's news too, and stale and disappointing. Now I'm just trying to stay out of trouble. A pathetic mantra, even to my own ears. The radio crackled on a shelf behind him, spitting out snippets of country music and local gossip. Mostly gossip about the weather and whose dog had gotten into whose garbage. Seemed like a safe level of drama, just the kind I was aiming for. The call came in around 10, dispatched Thivine aboard. Sounding teenager named Billy Four relayed a report from a hiker on the Blackwood Trail. Says he found a bird arranged like real weird arranged, I repeated. Grabbing my jacket, that is what he said. Says it looked like somebody posed it, with leaves and stuff. Billy's voice dripped with skepticism, probably just a prank. But Sheriff Brody wants you to take a look. Sheriff Brody, a man who hadn't chased anything more exciting than a runaway pig in the last decade, if the town's reputation held. Another reason Hollow Creek appealed to me. Low expectations, the trail was muddy and slick with fallen leaves. The air hung heavy with the scent of decaying wood and damp earth. It took me 20 minutes to reach the spot. The hiker, a middle-aged woman with a sensible hiking vest and a look of genuine unease, stood a few feet away, hands clasped tight. It is right there," she said, pointing. And there it was, a raven black as sin against the vibrant reds and golds of the autumn leaves. But it wasn't just time on the leaves, it was them, carefully positioned, wings slightly outstretched, head tilted as if in observation. A perfect, disturbing tableau. It looked studied, almost deliberate. "Did it look like a predator kill?" I asked, kneeling. "No. No feathers ruffled, no blood, just like someone put it there." I examined the bird. No obvious wounds, no signs of a struggle. The eyes were dull, but not glazed like you'd expect from an animal caught in the elements. I flipped it over carefully and felt a strange rigidity in the joints. This wasn't natural. A flicker of memory, unwelcome and sharp, stabbed through me. The lab, the precise measurements, the meticulous record-keeping, the pressure to soon find something, anything, to justify the funding. The night I hadn't checked the calibration on the telemetry, the cascade of errors, the deaths. I pushed the memory back down, a familiar ache settling in my chest. That was then. This was now, a dead raven in the woods. Probably just some kids being morbid. But something about the arrangement, the stillness, prickled the back of my neck. Probably just a natural death, Sheriff Brody said. Arriving with his usual leisurely pace, he glanced at the raven, then at the hiker, then back at me. Birds die. Doc, happens all the time, especially with the weather turning. He hadn't even crouched down to look, dismissed it out of hand. I wanted to agree, to let it go. It would be easier. It would keep my head down. It would preserve the fragile peace I'd constructed here. But I couldn't. I reached into the bird's plumage, carefully separating the feathers. It was then I found it. Tucked amongst the glossy black, a small object, a bone. No bigger than my thumbnail, smooth, white, and intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. Symbols that felt old and wrong. The bone felt heavier in my pocket with each passing hour. I spent the afternoon at the county library, a cramped, musty room smelling of old paper and forgotten stories. Hollow Creek didn't have much in the way of resources, but Mrs. Gable, the librarian, a woman built like a fire hydrant and with a matching disposition, pointed me towards the local history section. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight filtering through the grimy windows as I sifted through faded newspaper clippings and handwritten journals. The town's founding was typical enough thitty a handful of settlers escaping debt and bad luck, drawn by the promise of fertile land. But the further I dug, the more unsettling it became. Mentions of the old ways kept surfacing, whispers of traditions brought over from the mountains. Traditions best left buried. Then I found it, Temati, a brittle pamphlet from the 1920s detailing the history of a group called the Shepherd's Hand, a fraternal order dedicated to the preservation of rural heritage, according to the flowery language. But the illustrations, grainy and unsettling, depicted scenes that felt wrong, figures in hooded robes, pastoral symbols twisted into something sinister. And most disturbingly, animals arranged in patterns strikingly similar to the raven. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. A quirky historical footnote, but the nagging unease persisted. Sheriff Brody found me there, predictably, still poking around. "Doc," he drawled, leaning against a stack of books. "Thought I told you to let it go. Probably a bobcat got the raven plain and simple." "Maybe," I said, carefully closing the pamphlet. "Though it is unusual for a bobcat to arrange its prey with such precision," Brody snorted. "You are reading too many books, Creed. City folk always overthink things." He paused, his gaze hardening. "Just stay out of trouble, and stay off my back. I got real police work to do, like making sure Mrs. Henderson's prize, winning pumpkins, are secure, right?" I said, my jaw tight. Pumpkin security. That about summed it up. The second call came just before dusk. This time it was a report of a bobcat found off County Road 17. Near the old Hemlock Farm, the description was chillingly familiar, arranged, posed, with a disturbing stillness that echoed the raven. I arrived to find Deputy Miller, a young, eager man trying to project an authority he didn't possess, standing guard. The bobcat lay in a small clearing, surrounded by a meticulously constructed ring of fieldstones. Its body was aligned north to south, and a single crimson maple leaf rested on its forehead. The air was thick with a cloying sweetness I couldn't place. "Same as the bird, Doc," Miller said, his voice hushed. "It is creepy." Underneath the bobcat, etched into the damp earth, were symbols. The same symbols I'd seen on the bone. My stomach twisted. It wasn't a coincidence anymore. I needed to talk to someone who knew the area, someone who might have heard the stories. Old Man Hemlock lived on the edge of town, a hermit with a reputation for eccentricity and an encyclopedic knowledge of Hollow Creek's past. His farm was a dilapidated mess of overgrown fields and crumbling buildings, a place where time seemed to have stopped decades ago. He answered the door slowly, his eyes clouded with suspicion. The smell of wood smoke and something vaguely animalistic hung heavy in the air. He was ancient, his skin like cracked leather, and he held a gnarled walking stick as if bracing for a fight. "Heard about the animals," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "Bad omens, always are." "Do you know anything about the old ways?" I asked, showing him a photograph of the pamphlet's illustration. His eyes flickered over the image, then narrowed. "Stories. Just stories. Folks used to believe the forest needed appeasing back when things were hard, back before the church came." He stopped, his gaze distant. "Some say there were sacrifices to keep the land bountiful, to keep the winter at bay. Sacrifices." Hemlock shook his head, dismissing the idea with a wave of his hand. "Just stories, but stories have roots. Son, deep roots." He glanced nervously towards the woods. Then back at me, the shepherd's hand. They were always the keepers of those roots. They wanted the old ways to return. He wouldn't elaborate, refusing to meet my gaze, just mumbled about respecting the past and leaving well enough alone. As I left the farm, the woods felt different, darker, more watchful. I drove back towards town, the image of the bobcat and the carved symbols burned into my mind. I decided to take a shortcut, a dirt road leading through a particularly dense patch of forest. That is when I saw it, a flicker of movement in the periphery. A figure, cloaked and hooded, dancing in a clearing bathed in the pale moonlight. The movements were fluid, rhythmic, almost hypnotic, A low chanting drifted through the trees, a discordant drone that raised the hairs on my arms. The figure was surrounded by small glowing embers, arranged in a circular pattern. I killed the engine, my heart hammering in my chest. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands trembling. As I raised it, the figure stopped dancing, turned towards me, and then, with a speed that defied its apparent age, vanished into the shadows. The chanting stopped. The embers faded, and the forest fell silent once more. The flashlight beam danced across the forest floor, illuminating nothing but swirling leaves in the oppressive darkness. My boots crunched on unseen twigs, each snap echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. I retraced my steps, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. A dance, a hooded figure. Chanting. It felt staged, like a performance meant to be witnessed. And yet, I hadn't gotten a clear look. The woods seemed to swallow the figure whole. Back at the ranger station, Fruity, a glorified shed with a leaky roof, and I spread the research from the library across the table. The pamphlet, my hastily scribbled notes. Photographs of the symbols. They weren't random. After hours of cross-referencing archaic texts online, I found a match, a fragmented reference in a dusty book of Celtic mythology. The symbols belonged to Cernunnos, an ancient pagan deity. The horned god associated with the wild, with forests, with power over nature. A chill crawled down my spine. This wasn't some harmless historical reenactment. A call from Deputy Miller broke the silence. "Doc, you wouldn't believe it. Old man Tiber sheep. Found M this morning. Same as the raven and the bobcat." "Arranged?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Yeah. In a circle with flowers this time. And a little pile of acorns at each head." Miller sounded shaken. "Folks are getting spooked. Doc, real spooked." Spooked was an understatement. Apprehension was turning to something akin to fear, and I was starting to understand the pattern. It wasn't just about the animals. It was about the arrangement 20, the deliberate placement. The symbols. I dug into the county archives, requesting old police reports. Mrs. Gable had mentioned the shepherds, hand fading away in the 1960s. I needed to know if this had happened before. It took some coaxing, and a hefty bribe in the form of a blueberry pie from Mrs. Gable. But the reports eventually came, and there they were, scattered incidents over a 10-year period. Tiventi, a deer found posed with wildflowers, a flock of birds arranged in a spiral, a bear meticulously placed amongst fallen logs. Each incident dismissed as the work of pranksters or natural causes. But the dates, they coincided with a period of intense activity for the shepherdess hand. Documented in a forgotten article from the Asheville Citizen Times, the article spoke of rebalancing a belief that nature had been disrupted by modern life, and that sacrifices were necessary to appease the forest spirit and restore harmony. A terrifying ideology masked in pseudo-environmentalism. I needed a professional opinion. Dr. Evelyn Reed, the local veterinarian, was a no-nonsense woman who'd seen it all. She examined tissue samples from the bobcat, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Something's off." "Arlo," she said finally. Looking up, both the bobcat and the raven were sedated, heavily. "But the anesthetic, I've never seen anything like it. It is not commercially available, and it doesn't leave a trace in standard toxicology reports. Untraceable." That meant deliberate acquisition and someone with knowledge. Someone who knew how to handle animals, fueled by coffee and a growing dread. I started tracing the lineage of known shepherd, sand members. The records were sparse, riddled with aliases and dead ends. But I found one property linked to a Silas Blackwood 30 prominent figure in the cult S1950s heyday. An abandoned cabin deep in the woods, not far from where I'd seen the figure dancing. The cabin was a wreck, timbers rotting, windows broken. But beneath the floorboards, hidden behind a loose panel, I found a chamber small, circular, and lined with strange carvings that mirrored the symbols I'd seen on the bone and etched into the earth. A crude altar stood in the center, stained with something dark and dried leaves, animal hair, and a faint, metallic scent hung in the air. This wasn't a place for peaceful contemplation. This was a place for something else. As I backed out of the chamber, a horrifying realization solidified in my mind. This wasn't tea about preservation. It wasn't tea about respecting nature. It was about control, about bending the wild to their will. And the animals weren't tea the end goal. They were practice. I returned to my own cabin just after midnight. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. But something felt wrong. The front door hung ajar, splintered wood framing the opening. My meager belongings had been tossed around, papers strewn across the floor, furniture overturned. It wasn't a robbery. Nothing of value was missing. Then I saw it. On the table, constructed from the bones of small animals, twin birds, mice, a rabbit Sunia message, a crude, skeletal arrangement spelling out a single word, Ford, Finiv, Finim. Blood ran cold. They knew. They knew I was digging, and they were warning me. And I had a sickening feeling they weren't just warning me about my job. The rain started just after dawn, a cold, insistent drizzle that seeped into everything. It felt fitting. Hollow Creek had a way of mirroring your mood, amplifying whatever darkness lurked within. I spent the morning poring over old land surveys at the county courthouse, trying to understand the connection between the shepherd's hand and the parcel of land where my research had gone so catastrophically wrong. The Henderson Project. Just the name tasted like ash in my mouth. It hadn't been about profit, not initially. I'd been chasing a breakthrough in migratory pattern prediction, using advanced telemetry to track the movements of the Cerulean Warbler. A small bird, beautiful and fragile. But the land I'd secured for the study, a sprawling tract of forested hills, my theme bordered a section of untamed wilderness. A section, I now realized with a sickening lurch, that was historically considered sacred by the shepherd's hand. Flashbacks hit me in waves. The late nights in the lab fueled by caffeine and ambition. The pressure from the university to produce results. The ill-fated decision to reroute the telemetry grid of a seemingly minor adjustment to improve signal strength. An adjustment I hadn't properly calibrated. The consequences had been devastating. My telemetry interfered with the birds' natural navigation, disrupting their migration path. Hundreds, maybe thousands, perished. The Henderson report didn't just detail my scientific errors. It laid bare my arrogance, my obsession, my reckless disregard for the delicate balance of nature. The shepherd's hand hadn't commented publicly at the time, but now, looking at the ancient maps tracing the contours of their traditional territory, it all clicked into place. To them, it wasn't just about birds, it was about disrupting a sacred flow, offending the forest spirit. It was about transgression. Dr. Reed confirmed my growing fears. The bones used in the skeletal message weren't just any animal bones. They're specifically from species used in their rituals, she said, handing me microscopic slides. Deer, raven, bobcat. But also, curiously, fragments of songbird skeletons. Cerulean warblers even. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't random. It was a direct response to my past. They weren't just warning me off. They were targeting me. My attempt to speak with Sheriff Brody met with hostility. I laid out my findings, the connection to my research, the ritualistic nature of the animal deaths. He listened, his face impassive, until I mentioned the shepherd's hand. That is just local folklore, Creed, he said, his voice flat. Old wives' tales. It is more than that, Sheriff. People are scared. We need to take this seriously. He finally looked up, his eyes narrowed. You're stirring up trouble. Creed, you always were a troublemaker. Then the bombshell, my grandfather. He was involved with them. Back in the 50s, said they were just trying to protect the old ways. A protector, a participant. The complacency suddenly made sense. The dismissal, the deliberate blindness. So you knew, I asked, my voice tight with anger. I knew things were complicated, he said, avoiding my gaze. And I'm telling you to back off. This town doesn't need outsiders digging up old ghosts. I left his office feeling colder than I had in years. The sheriff wasn't going to help. I was on my own. I returned to the cabin, desperate for answers. I remembered old man Hemlock muttering something about a reawakening ceremony. The shepherd's hand had been planning for decades. The cabin of Silas Blackwood suddenly felt like the key. Another search, more thorough this time, led to a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside, I found a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with a spidery script and unsettling illustrations. The language was archaic, filled with references to Cernunnos and the forest hunger. It detailed the cult's beliefs, their rituals, and their plans for the upcoming Reawakening ceremony designed to restore the balance of nature to appease the ancient spirit. I skimmed through the pages, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I stopped. A passage written in a bolder hand described the final sacrifice, a necessary offering to fully awaken the forest spirit, and the description: a creature touched by transgression, one who has disrupted the flow, offended the wild, and brought darkness upon the land. The words stared back at me, cold and accusing. It wasn't just about my past research. It wasn't just about the birds. It was about Sudi mine. They weren't just warning me to leave, they were preparing me for a sacrifice. The journal's code was deceptively simple. A substitution cipher based on the phases of the moon. By late afternoon, I translated enough to pinpoint the location of the reawakening Blackwood Caves. A sprawling network of caverns, honeycombing the mountainside just beyond Old Man Hemlock's farm. A place locals avoided, whispered to be haunted by the ghosts of the mountain. Now I knew why. The rain had intensified, turning the dirt roads into slick, muddy tracks. I drove as fast as I dared, the headlights cutting through the downpour. The air crackled with a strange energy, a feeling of anticipation that had nothing to do with the weather. The entrance to Blackwood Caves was hidden behind a curtain of vines and a crumbling stone facade. A flickering torchlight spilled out, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. The chanting had already begun, Sweni, a low, rhythmic drone that vibrated in my chest. I parked the ranger truck a safe distance away, grabbed my flashlight and a heavy-duty wrench from the toolkit Fethetic weapons against a fanatic cult. But all I had doing and moved in. The cave opened into a vast chamber, illuminated by dozens of torches and the eerie glow of phosphorescent moss. At least 30 figures clad in hooded robes stood in a circle, swaying and chanting. In the center, on a raised stone platform, stood a man 20 tall, imposing with a face hidden within the depths of his hood. The leader. The air was thick with the smell of incense, damp earth, and something else, something metallic and unsettling. I moved silently along the periphery, trying to assess the situation. Several of the faces in the crowd were familiar. Faces I'd seen at the diner at the general store. Even Deputy Miller's nervous face, barely visible within the sea of robes. The leader raised his hands, his voice booming through the cavern. The time has come to rebalance the scales, to appease the forest spirit and restore harmony to the land. He turned his gaze, sweeping across the crowd, and then it landed on me, a slow, deliberate scan that sent a jolt of ice through my veins. "He is here," the leader said, his voice resonating with chilling authority. "The transgressor, the one who dared to disrupt the natural order." All heads turned towards me, chaos erupted. The hooded figures surged forward, their faces contorted with zealotry. I swung the wrench, catching one man in the shoulder, sending him stumbling back. But they were too many. I fought my way through the throng, dodging blows, scrambling over rocks, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Suddenly, a familiar voice cut through the melee. "Hold it right there." Sheriff Brody, flanked by Deputy Miller and 2 state troopers, burst into the cavern. He looked torn, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "This is the law," he shouted, his voice wavering slightly. But his hesitation was obvious. He wasn't fully committed. A brawl broke out. Punches were thrown. Bodies collided. The cavern echoed with shouts and grunts. The cultists fought with a desperate intensity, their eyes burning with religious fervor. I used the chaos to my advantage, weaving through the fighting, trying to reach the leader. I remembered something from the journal Thunny, a mention of a secondary chamber connected to the main cavern by a narrow passage, a natural fault line, prone to collapse, a dangerous gamble. But my only chance, I pushed my way towards the passage, using the terrain to my advantage, ducking behind stalactites, scrambling over loose rocks. The cultists followed, relentless in their pursuit. I reached the passage and squeezed through, triggering a small rock slide that momentarily blocked their path. I crawled through the narrow tunnel, the air growing colder and damper. The passage opened into a smaller chamber lit by a single torch. And there, bound and gagged to a stone altar, was Sarah Jenkins, the waitress from Tiber's diner, her eyes wide with terror. The leader appeared behind me, his face finally revealed in the torchlight. He was older than I expected, with a gaunt face and piercing blue eyes. He held a ceremonial dagger, its blade gleaming in the dim light. "A fitting sacrifice," he said, his voice a low growl. "A creature touched by transgression, and a beautiful offering to appease the spirit." He lunged, I sidestepped, knocking the dagger from his hand. A brutal struggle followed, a desperate dance between life and death. I managed to disarm him again, pinning him to the ground. But his strength was surprising. He bucked and thrashed, trying to break free. Just as I had him contained, a shout echoed from the main cavern. "Creed, Jenkins, they're getting away." I glanced towards the entrance to the main chamber. The sheriff and the troopers were overwhelmed, struggling to contain the remaining cultists. Then I saw it. The leader, using the distraction, had broken free. He grabbed Sarah Jenkins, dragging her towards a deeper, unexplored section of the cave system. A dark, winding tunnel disappearing into the abyss. "No," I shouted, lunging forward, but it was too late. The leader disappeared into the darkness, Sarah Jenkins in tow. The chanting, fainter now, echoed from the depth of the earth. The reawakening wasn't over. It had just begun. The air in the narrow tunnels tasted like whetstone and something older, something acrid and unsettling. Each step echoed, amplified by the claustrophobic space. The leader, surprisingly agile for his age, moved ahead, Sarah Jenkins slung over his shoulder like a sack of grain. His chanting had resumed, a droning litany that seemed to vibrate within my skull. He wasn't running, not exactly. He was leading me deeper, into the heart of the mountain. The tunnels twisted and turned, a labyrinth of natural formations and crudely constructed passageways. I spotted tripwires almost hidden in the darkness. Simple but effective traps designed to collapse sections of the cave. He was testing me, gauging my resolve, or maybe just ensuring only the truly dedicated reached their destination. Finally, the tunnel opened into a vast, hidden chamber. A cathedral of stone, shimmering with phosphorescent fungi. In the center stood an altar, not made of stone, but of woven roots and branches, pulsing with a faint, organic light. "This is where it ends," the leader said, his voice devoid of emotion. He lowered Sarah Jenkins to the altar, her eyes wide with terror. "The forest demands balance, and humanity has tipped the scales." "You're insane," I rasped, my throat raw from exertion. He turned, a slow, deliberate movement. "Insane? No. Realistic. You scientists, you tinkerers, you think you can control nature, but nature always finds a way. It corrects itself, sometimes with drastic measures." His face, finally fully illuminated by the glowing fungi, was gaunt and weathered, etched with fanaticism. He spoke with a chilling calm, as if discussing a scientific theorem rather than a human sacrifice. "We're not about destruction," he continued. "We're about restoration, a necessary pruning. The weak must fall so the strong can thrive." Then he said something that stopped me cold. "You, Dr. Creed, embody everything that is wrong with this world. Your recklessness, your arrogance, you disrupted a sacred path. Your work led to the decline of this land." He paused, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "My son Daniel was a naturalist, a student of the forest. He dedicated his life to studying the Cerulean Warblers. He was devastated by their disappearance, driven to despair. He took his own life." My blood ran cold. Daniel Blackwood. I remembered the name from the research notes, a promising young ornithologist who'd vanished shortly after the Henderson report was published. I hadn't known my mistake had cost someone their life. "You blame me," I whispered, the weight of my past pressing down on me. "Blame doesn't begin to cover it," he said, his eyes burning with rage. "You stole his future, and now you will pay the price." He lunged, the ceremonial dagger flashing in the dim light. I sidestepped, grabbing his wrist. A brutal struggle ensued, a desperate dance for survival in the heart of the earth. He was stronger than he looked, fueled by years of unwavering belief. We grappled and wrestled, stumbling over rocks and around the ancient altar. I managed to disarm him again, driving him back against the rough stone wall. But he wouldn't yield. He clawed and scratched, his eyes filled with a terrifying zeal. "The forest will be avenged," he screamed. I forced him back, intending to subdue him, but he stumbled, losing his footing. His body slammed against a weakened section of the cave wall. A tremor ran through the chamber. Dust rained down from the ceiling. A section of the roof collapsed, sending a cascade of rock and debris crashing down. I shielded Sarah Jenkins with my body, bracing for the impact. When the dust settled, the chamber was shrouded in darkness. I coughed, struggling to clear my lungs. Sarah was shaken but unharmed. The cult leader was gone. Buried beneath tons of rock and rubble, I searched, calling out his name, but there was no response, only the dripping of water and the silence of the mountain. He was entombed. We stumbled out of the caves, blinking in the sudden brightness of the daylight. Sheriff Brody and Deputy Miller were waiting, their faces etched with relief. Sarah was rushed to the hospital, shaken but alive. The remaining cult members were rounded up, their fanaticism deflated by the cave-in and the leader's apparent death. They offered vague justifications, whispers of ecological balance and ancient spirits. But as I stood there, watching the ambulance disappear down the muddy road, a chilling uncertainty lingered. I hadn't seen a body, and something about the leader's unwavering conviction, his intimate knowledge of the caves, suggested he'd been prepared for this. He might be gone, buried beneath the stone, or he might be waiting, lurking in the shadows, plotting his next move. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that the forest wouldn't forget. The rain finally stopped, leaving Hollow Creek washed and glistening. The cleanup was slow, methodical. The state police had taken over the investigation, sifting through the rubble of the collapsed cave, searching for any sign of the leader. They found nothing, no body, just the echoing silence of the mountain. The remaining cult members, a motley collection of disillusioned locals and fervent believers, were rounded up. Deputy Miller, looking utterly broken, confessed to being a peripheral member, drawn in by promises of restoring the natural order. Sheriff Brody, his face etched with exhaustion and shame, mostly kept to himself, staring out at the rain-soaked hills as if searching for answers in the mist. I saw him once, down by the river, skipping stones. He didn't meet my eye. He was grappling with a legacy he hadn't asked for, a darkness that ran deeper than Hollow Creek itself. Sarah Jenkins recovered, though the trauma lingered. She returned to the diner, her hands still trembling as she poured coffee. But her smile, when she managed one, felt a little brighter. The town slowly, tentatively began to heal. I surprised everyone, including myself, when I declined the offer to return to my old life. The university called, offering a research position, a chance to rebuild my reputation. But the thought of sterile labs and abstract data felt hollow. I'd spent too long chasing accolades, ignoring the consequences of my actions. I applied for the permanent park ranger position. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. It was a chance to work with the land, to understand it, to protect it, and maybe, just maybe, to atone for the damage I'd caused. I spent my days mapping the cave system, identifying unstable areas, and working with a team of biologists to assess the impact of the cult's activities on the local ecosystem. We discovered several rare plant species thriving in the darkness, and a surprisingly diverse population of bats. The forest, it seemed, was resilient, but it needed help. I used my knowledge of migratory patterns to establish protected corridors for the Cerulean Warblers, working with local landowners to create a network of safe havens. It was a small step, but it felt significant. A way to honor Daniel Blackwood's memory, to undo some of the harm I'd inadvertently caused. One crisp autumn morning, I stood in a clearing, a rehabilitated raven perched on my gloved hand. Its feathers were sleek and black, its eyes bright and alert. I'd found it injured near the cave entrance, a victim of the chaos. I'd nursed it back to health, and now it was time to let it go. I opened my hand, and the raven soared into the sky, circling once before disappearing into the trees. A sense of peace settled over me, a quiet acceptance of my past. I wasn't the man I once was. I was flawed, haunted, but I was also hopeful. I returned to my cabin, the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard, and that is when I saw it. Lying on my doorstep, a single, freshly carved bone, small, white and intricately etched with the same unsettling symbols I'd first encountered on the Blackwood Trail. A subtle reminder, a silent warning. The old ways may have been disrupted, but they hadn't been extinguished. They were still out there, lurking in the shadows. waiting for the right moment to reemerge. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the forest would always be watching.